morning. Welcome to 29. We're talking about the weapons effect, and we are continuing with the weapons effect. So, still morning. Can't you see? The sun's coming up. In a second experiment, the researchers arranged for a truck to stall at a busy junction. On some occasions, the trucks displayed a rifle in a gun rack, clearly visible to cars behind. At other times, there was no gun. The researchers found that the cars honked more and more persistently at the stalled truck if it had a rifle in the back, or in the rack. Leonard Berkowitz, who carried out the first experiments on the weapons effect more than 10 years ago, and whose findings aroused no little controversy, believes that the latest research confirms his early conclusion that the finger pulls the trigger, but the trigger might also be pulling the finger. 10 years ago, in the 80s, means that these experiments must have been run in the early to mid 70s. And there was a bit of controversy because he says that his research confirms his earlier conclusion that the finger pulls the trigger, yes, but the trigger might also be pulling the finger, as in we will feel more potentially threatened because the guy has a gun. But I'm thinking about all those Gen Xers who talk about, well, we had a gun rack in our car, we parked it in our pickup trucks in the high school parking lots, and nobody was afraid. And I'll tell you from personal experience, I would feel safer if somebody was open carrying or had it around. Like I would know that protection is coming, or protection is available. And why would I think that? I'm not in a cult. I don't have a lot of gun crime or anything. I'm not scared of it. I had some training in weapons. I also know that bad guys will sneak and hide the fact that they have a weapon because they want to bring it out on you to have control over you. Somebody who is having it on display or at the ready is merely trying to avail himself to be of assistance. He's not going to suddenly pull it out and, I don't know. I mean, that's me, but I'm sure he found all kinds of different people. Let's see what they say. Berkowitz considers that weapons act as a conditioned stimulus, eliciting a conditioned response. What I'm trying to figure out is where, when, in the age of the 1970s, coming from the people from the 50s and 60s, how did they get conditioned to respond to fear? Is it because of the movies? Huh? Is it because of the movies? Don't shoot! Did we see that so many times? I don't know. Turner offers another but similar explanation, which leans more on the information processing concepts. He holds that guns remind people of occasions when they have seen aggression rewarded, for example, on television, where the villain or hero may use a gun to get his way. It becomes easy, therefore, to connect guns with the rewards of aggression, and, on catching sight of a gun in whatever context, to act more aggressively than normal habits would allow. Normal habits would allow. Okay. Needless to say, all the researchers support the case for less violence on television in Psychology Today, June 1981. Role-playing. It has already been suggested by various researchers in the context of conditioning and hypnosis that participating in the action helps elicit the desired response. Psychologists have shown through controlled experiments that participating in various events, even supposedly as a game, can definitely make an individual's attitude toward that event more positive than before. In studies, for instance, where students had been asked to improvise arguments for a position that they do not themselves hold, their attitudes toward that position have been shown to be strengthened. Acting out was more effective for inducing attitude change than reading out loud from script, not only in themselves, but in those hearing them. However, the strongest changes came about in the attitudes of those who did the actual role play. Trying to identify with another person's point of view is not as effective as acting it out. In an experiment with college students where each had to take a turn in acting a role, then trying to identify with somebody else playing a role, and, lastly, just watching someone perform a role as an objective observer, all the students had taken on more of the views of the person they had role-played than those of the person they had tried to identify with, or had just listened to. One experimenter, Hovland, commented on the power of the improvisation as an attitude changer by saying it required a person to think up all the arguments and appeals that he thinks would be most convincing to a person like himself. And in so doing, it is himself he persuades. Also, that's sort of like those people who say, I was an atheist and then I studied the Bible. I started out trying to debunk it and then I started to believe in it. Could play into that. Also, the very act of improvising a role precludes rational weighing up of alternatives. The very act of improvising this role precludes rational weighing of alternatives. All energy goes into portraying the appeal of the message. Role-playing is much used in therapy to encourage patients to empathize with the position of important others. For instance, a man who had held a grudge against his mother all his life might come to appreciate her feelings more if he were obliged to act her part in a particular scenario while someone else plays his own. This is a feature of psychodrama. It has also been suggested that trade union and management representatives at loggerheads because of perpetual set, in Chapter 3, prevents them from seeing another point of view. But they might do well to switch roles in order to open up their perspective. In encounter groups, a common ploy is to get a person to act out repressed anger by beating a pillow and pretending that the pillow is his wife, his mother, father, etc. It starts out as forced artificial attempts at anger, soon tend to be overtaken by the real thing, with the person often overcome by the intensity of his angry emotions, which emerge full flow. Role-playing emotion can thus precipitate real emotion. Writing an essay on a given subject can have similar effects to role-playing. An individual is required to think up arguments to sustain a position he may not hold, and the creative act is sufficient to make those ideas start to gel in his own head. A recent piece of research indicated that committing something to paper reinforces our belief in it, whatever it is that we have written. 3 psychologists at Rice University in Houston, Texas, showed students a passage about firefighting, which either indicated that the successful firefighter took risks, or else that he played it safe. A third of the students were asked to write about the relationship between firefighting and risk-taking. Then they, and another third, were told that all the information had been made up. Later, all the groups were given a test to see if they still held to the views that the information had suggested. The group that did not know the material had been invented was, as expected, the most swayed by its content. But the rest of the students who had to write about risk-taking and successful firefighting were far more strongly entrenched in the belief that it was true than those who had just read it and then been disabused of its credibility. From Psychology Today, 1981. May 1981. Okay, so what did I just read? I just read that they had to read some information. Some of them had to write a report on the information. And the ones who didn't keep relieving it. They, after they were told that it was false. But the ones that wrote about how it was true stuck to their guns just a little bit more. So they probably remained curious. It seemed plausible. Participation was a tactic for winning people over to one side. Has been seen at work in some bad place. Prisoners were required to write confessions and autobiographies. The very act of doing which may have affirmed the very act of doing which may have affirmed the validity of what they produced. It will be seen again in the context of cults and other political groups in Chapter 8. Sensory deprivation. Sensory deprivation experiments involving the subjects and remaining without stimulation of any kind in light-proof and soundproof rooms have produced conflicting results about the effects of sensory deprivation on human behavior. Some people can and do adapt. Others experience hallucinations very quickly and lose all sense of time. Which effect will be produced in a person largely depends on the individual's normal needs for external stimulation, the extrovert suffering more than the introvert. However, it has been shown that sensory deprivation slows down brain functioning, impairs intellectual capacities, and increases suggestibility. See the book, Inside the Black Room. One experiment was carried out by Dr. Schvedfield at Princeton University to measure the effect of sensory deprivation on susceptibility to propaganda. His aim was to produce an attitude change favorable to Turkey in people whose attitudes had previously been neutral. Half of Schvedfield's subjects were confined under sensory deprivation conditions for 24 hours. The other half could move about the university building as they pleased. Afterward, all the students heard propaganda favorable to Turkey. The sensory deprivation students experienced an attitude change in the way intended that was 8 times greater as that experienced by the non-confined students. We're not fooling around today. We are reading, and that's all we're doing. Except for this part where I'm just chewing some food for you to keep you awake. It's cool. Alright. Professor Jack Vernon of Princeton University carried out a large number of sensory deprivation experiments and, in his book Inside the Black Room, suggests a scenario for creating attitude change which incorporates findings from sensory deprivation research, conditioning, cognitive dissonance, dependence, obedience to authority, and participation as a means of attitude change. This is the scene he proposed. He notes that first, in the softening up process preceding brainwashing, and in the sensory deprivation condition, a confined person will experience such dreadful monotony and boredom that he will be grateful for absolutely any novelty to distract him. This could be taken advantage of, says Vernon. If the aim is to instill a particular belief in a person, he suggests, for experiment's sake, that someone who is a strong Protestant, although he doesn't know much about Protestantism, is to be converted to some other religion, about which he knows very little either, but he is prejudiced enough to hate them. To convert him, says Vernon, the best procedure would be to leave him in sensory deprivation conditions for up to 4 days, to bring him to the point where he is desperate for stimulus of any kind. Then Vernon would introduce, without any explanation, 2 switches into the crucible. The prisoner would soon find that if he pressed button A, he heard a speech favoring Protestantism. If he pressed button B, he got a speech favoring the other guy. But the difference was that button A always produced the same speech on Protestantism, whereas button B released an endless variety of speeches on the other guy, all delivered by different voices. Desire for novelty would lead the prisoner to start selecting button B over button A. We have caused this individual, by his own choice, to listen to our propaganda. If we can get him to listen, we can get him to believe by making our propaganda clever enough, says Vernon. And it isn't all supposition. And it isn't all supposition. An experiment at McGill University in Canada found that subjects did indeed listen more often to varied, unfavored items than the same favored item when in a condition of having no other choice. But Vernon carries on. Even if the prisoner does insist on using button A, it still works against him, he says, because repetition can weaken meaning. He recalls the familiar experience of repeating a word over and over, and finding that it suddenly becomes strange. Ambiguity. As though it were a new word. Its meaning seems to have weakened. Vernon says, it seems reasonable to believe that something similar to this process could happen as a result of repeating a slogan, and refers to the Chinese usage, perhaps unwittingly, of this technique in... I keep mentioning the names of people that I'm not supposed to talk about. Well, don't you care who used these techniques? Or do you just want to know what these techniques are? See, that's my point. You know what they are, and it doesn't matter if you name the person who's using it. Whoever's using it is an asshole. Okay? Refers to the blank usage, perhaps unwittingly, of this technique in some bad place, some bad people, in some bad place. Prisoners had to write their autobiographies over and over, and consequently got very bored. The bad people probably did not realize that it was the monotonous repetition that was weakening some of the soldiers' cherished beliefs. They were only looking for discrepancies in the reports. These were considered to be signs of weak areas, and consequently the logical focus of their psychological attack to convert the prisoner to some bad ideology. Our prisoner, meanwhile, is still listening to the propaganda. Vernon says that now is the time to reward any signs of conversion. So, the prisoners ask questions about that religion over the intercom. If he replies in the desired way, he might get a little light or a new kind of food. Later, he might even be allowed to talk to someone in person. Vernon points out that this reward tactic for right responses was certainly commonly used by the bad people, and suggests why they were so often successful. The responses are the responses are forthcoming from the individual and not forced out of him by pain or punishment, thereby making them more clearly his own beliefs. Still acting the role of the propagandist, Vernon pursues his theme even further. We now feel that we can devise a system that will enhance the increased suggestibility to an even greater extent. It is possible that the suggestions given by the experimenter will be much more effective if he is established as a figure of authority in the mind of the subject. Suggestibility probably can be increased if the subject is more just all these different fantastic techniques for how we can change your mind. And they learned this by studying how they did change the mind. So it's like could be good, could be evil, is good, is evil, isn't either, isn't evil, isn't good. I mean, human minds are wonderfully fascinating. I can't wait to get to fiction. Oh, hey, let's just finish this chapter, okay? We're almost done with this chapter. Alright. Serious. If the experimenter gives him his meal, suggestibility probably can be increased if the subject is more dependent upon the experimenter during the sensory deprivation. For example, if the experimenter gives him his meals, permission to leave the bed or to go to the toilet, tells him when he may sleep, interrupts his sleep with occasional tasks, regulates his water supply, and in general becomes part of his every activity, at the same time keeping his activities to a minimum. Vernon hypothesizes it is not outlandish nor particularly difficult to arrange, and it certainly takes advantage of all that is known about attitude influence techniques. From real studies on suggestibility in sensory deprivation conditions, Vernon found that suggestibility in all ways could be increased after 2 or 3 days and becomes 4 times greater than before. But he also found that it was lost no longer than 2 days after the experimental conditions were terminated, if gains were not consolidated thereafter. Why should one become suggestible in such conditions? Vernon explains that the brainstem reticular formation acts as a way station for all messages coming in and going out of the brain. Normally, it inhibits some messages and enhances others, thus dictating which ones get paid conscious attention. Conditions of sensory deprivation probably reduce the amount of information passing through the reticular formation, suggests Vernon. If this is the case, then the importance of any given set of neutral events may be greatly enhanced. Said more simply, under the condition of sensory deprivation, the human may be able to content himself with ideas or cognitions that he would otherwise simply dismiss. This chapter and the previous 3 have attempted to highlight the part that conditioned learning, conditioned emotions, unquestioned assumptions, and unconscious social behavior, which produce the brainwashing effect on American POWs in some bad place, can also play individually to influence ordinary reality, everyday behaviors, ordinary everyday behaviors and decisions. The next chapters will investigate whether such processes, singly or in combination, may help to explain how hypnosis works, how dramatic political and religious conversions are experienced, and how respected authority figures such as police and doctors can unwittingly direct behavior in ordinary society. Alright, we're going to be starting up with Chapter 7 when I come back.